So welcome everyone. My name is Jen Currin. I'm a local writer and teacher, and I'll be your host today for our panel, which is the art of the short story. I wanted to start by just asking you all to join me in closing your eyes and just settling in your chair. Maybe putting one or both hands over your heart space. Just take a few breaths, taking a moment to arrive in this space we'll share together for the next hour and a half. And from this place of quietude and heart presence, I hope you will join me in acknowledging the waterways and the lands that we occupy. We're on the traditional, unceded, ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I wanted to start with a few words from a wonderful writer and thinker a Stolo writer and thinker who has recently left this world for the next one. And she's a writer who I return to again and again. Her name is Lee Miracle, and I'm just going to read a short passage from her book, Memory Serves, which I highly recommend if you haven't had a chance to read. Song is our first language. Songs are the unadorned emotionality of our community and ourselves in relation to community. They are the springboard from which our words began. We seek resonance when we speak. We struggle for rhythm. We invert and infix words into a sentence because they sound better that way. We construct metaphorical extravaganzas rich in poetics because the subject is so difficult and requires so much beauty that we are obliged to do so. Normally, a story is told by a number of people in the longhouse, and so sometimes the voice changes and the story shifts just slightly because maybe an elder is talking in the story. So I shift and write in the voice of the elders, translating and transforming English into a shape that is purely Salish. Sometimes it is a warrior speaking, club rattling, quiver full of arrows shaking in the wind as the enemy approaches. And the language becomes forceful, powerful, a huge tsunami to be attended to. My language shifts again to the sound of the rattling of the club, or the quiver of the arrows, or the howling of the wind. I never let go of this song in the story. And again, that's Lee Miracle from her book, Memory Serves. So I just want to start by there's a few announcements I have to make. So just a reminder, you can buy the author's books at the Iron Dog book table, right out by the big windows out in the foyer. And if you can't find a book by one of these authors at that book table, they might have also brought copies to sell, so feel free to approach them after the panel if they might have one. And then I need to thank the sponsors. Thank you to SFU and the Writers Studio for providing space for Word this year. There's a long list of other funders, including the Canada Arts Council, the Canada Book Fund, the Canada Heritage Fund, the Canada Periodical Fund, the BC Arts Council, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, and many others that you can see on the website, wordvancouver.ca. And then lastly, just reminding folks that without donations, the Free Festival can't happen, that ongoing donations are needed. So if you feel moved to, please consider making a donation online at wordvancouver.ca. And so I'm going to start with introductions. And so I have Wayde Compton here to my right. Wayde has written 5 books and edited 2 literary anthologies. His collection of short stories, which he has right here, The Outer Harbour, won the City of Vancouver Book Award in 2015, and he won a National Magazine Award for Fiction in 2011. His work has been a finalist for 2 other City of Vancouver Book Awards, as well as the Dorothy Lysay Poetry Prize. In 2006, Compton co-founded Commodore Books, Western Canada's first Black Canadian literary press. And he's the former director of the SFU Writers Studio and the Creative Writing Program in Continuing Studies here at SFU, which some of you might be familiar with. His latest book, The Blue Road, is a fantasy graphic novel for young adults, and he is currently working on a reimagining of the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes as surrealist slave narrative set on the west coast of North America in the 18th century. Compton is currently the chair of creative writing at Douglas College in New West. And then next to Wayde is Cathy Stonehouse, the author of the novel The Causes, 2 collections of poetry, The Words I Know and Gray's Shiver, as well as a collection of short fiction, Something About the Animal. Their fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, and literary reviews have appeared in a wide range of journals, including the Globe and Mail, Best Canadian Stories 2019-2010, and other anthologies and publications. They were the editor of Event Magazine for 3 years, and they also edited the creative nonfiction anthology Double Lives, Writing and Motherhood. And their research interests include experimental fiction, cross-genre writing, and illustrated and graphic narrative. And next to Cathy is Carleigh Baker, an author and teacher of Cree, Métis, and European descent. She lives on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Her debut story collection, Bad Endings, won the City of Vancouver Book Award. So we've got a few City of Vancouver Book Award winners here, and was also a finalist for the Roger Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Emerging Indigenous Voices Award for Fiction. She teaches creative writing at SFU and has 2 books forthcoming that I'm really looking forward to. Last Woman, a short story collection, and Mudlarkers, a novel, both forthcoming from McLuhan and Stewart. And then next to Carleigh is Nathan Adler, the author of Wrist, a collection of short stories, right? That's when I'm going to yes. Oh, Ghost Lake, yeah, Wrist, and Ghost Lake is the stories, and Ghost Lake, a collection of short stories, and the co-editor of Bawajigan, Stories of Power. He has an MFA in creative writing from UBC, is a recipient of an Indigenous Voices Award for published English prose, and a Nottish Reveal Award for literature. He is Jewish, an Ojibwe, and a member of Lac des Mille Lac First Nation. So I join you in welcoming our panelists today. And so we're going to start with just a short reading from each of them. And so we'll just go in the same order that I did with the bios. So Wayde, Cathy, Carleigh, and Nathan. We're going to hear just a little bit of short story from each person.
I'll just read the first bit from a story called The Lost Island, which is about a volcanic island emerging right up there. Well, that way. Jean has seen it. It's been there above those waves for 1.5 years now. It's a natural miracle for the way it rose up out of the sea, burning and sending skyward a fountain of dry ash from the mouth of the inlet. But the island is nothing personal until the morning she is reading the sun and drinking tea, and Fletcher, her roommate, tosses an essay on top of the paper, blotting out its field of words with his. Look, he says. The pages are warm and smell like toner, freshly poured forth from Fletcher's printer. He sits down and stares at her. She realizes he's waiting for her to read it right now. The essay is a solid block of geological jargon, and after 2 paragraphs, she stops and skims. When even her skimming mires, she looks up at him and asks, "Why are you showing me this?" "I want to go there," Fletcher says. "Where?" "There." Jean looks at the essay. They've turned it into a protected zone, a national site for research, she points out. Nobody can go there but scientists. Indian land, he says. Brand new land, brand new colonization. Fletcher makes a gesture toward the kitchen window. He says, it's worth some kind of intervention, occupation. Throw a monkey wrench in the data collection. Get in on the anti-colonial ground floor, like. She looks back at the essay. hyaloclastite brachia, opaque petrology, co-ignium bright plumes. The language sits there and stares back. The language of dirt. 100 fancy words for dirt. Flaming dirt, rising up out of the dirt, spewing a mist of dirt all over the settled dirt. It is impossible for her not to think of the Bible. Impossible for her not to think of clay. Impossible for her not to think of a few huffs of breath and how that's us. Impossible for her not to think of how colonized her thinking is. Ground floor to glass ceiling.
Thank you so much. I'll hear those words again.
I'm going to read from slightly about the third into a story called Salt and Clay. And what you need to know is it's set in the UK in the late 80s, 90s in a small village, and it's an area where there was salt mining. So that's the kind of historical background. It's written from the point of view of a character, Shelley, whose best friend, Jackie, comes to a bit of a sticky end. Anyway, just the excerpt. Jacqueline Titania Gormley, thin and dark, at 9 she claimed she was an exiled Russian princess. At 11 swore on the Bible that she was related to Gandhi. Her middle name came from Shakespeare because both her parents were film stars, or wanted to be, before they got married. In reality, they owned a fleet of ice cream vans. At 16, she was found dead in a cornfield, strangled with her own black studded belt. When Shelley told Jackie about sleeping with her neighbor Paul, Jackie didn't seem impressed. Instead, she just took another drag on her menthol cigarette and went on to describe her cousin Robert's tattoo. Robert was 25 and worked on an oil rig. It's a Chinese dragon, bright red, and get this, when he comes, it curls around his thigh and licks his dick. Robert, Jackie went on to say, had screwed her twice a year since she turned 8. Christmas and Easter. Those were the only times that he got leave. There was an awkward pause. Then the two of them cracked up and Shelley poured yet more wine into Jackie's mouth. After that, Shelley felt oddly safer, as if some secret burden of secrecy had been lifted. She and Jackie had known each other for years, but only now were they real best mates. Jackie and Shelley stuffing themselves with Smarties, the two of them in hot pants playing British Bulldog, True Dare, Kiss, Commando, Promise. The two of them had always been close. But there were other children in the street. Matthew Harris, who spent his life rehearsing headers for the day he'd represent England at the World Cup. Gary Vickers, who scooped up spawn from the stagnant pond each spring, stored it in glass jars until it hatched. Gary Vickers, who couldn't wait till he grew up and became a fireman. How could he possibly know what he wanted, thought Shelley, who only ever wanted to go backwards, to regress to babyhood and then back to oblivion. In her dreams, Gary's frogs leapt backwards, reabsorbed their legs, then shrank back down into dots, until, with consummate tenderness, Gary in the dream opened his fingers and released the frog spawn back into the pond. I'll just stop there.
Thank you. It's so rich. Thank you.
Okay, I'm right in the middle of writing a collection right now, so I thought I'd read you something fresh. This is from Last Woman, and it's called Burial Ground, and it's a bit of a take on the Indian burial ground trope from horror films. And I picked this actually because I knew you were reading it. And late stage capitalism. Men in suits filled the office on the 30th floor, and Ronald delivered the pitch. The fulfillment center would be Langford's salvation, 500,000 square feet of bustling commerce on land that wasn't being used for anything productive, not anymore. Rolling Hills Mall was long dead. Teenagers used to fill the place every weekend, pinching each other's butts, stuffing themselves with hot pretzels and orange Julius's. Parents brought their kids to Santa's workshop in the winter and air-conditioned matinees in the summer. And every season, people shopped from 9 a.m. until 10 p.m. to a soundtrack of smooth jazz. Now, seniors in matching tracksuits use its empty halls as a walking track. Demolition would be a breeze, as the mall had been on its last legs for a decade, moldering slowly into oblivion and, frankly, causing a health and safety risk for the seniors. Not only would the fulfillment center would be making money, it would be saving lives. Ronald snapped his ledger closed and smiled at the room full of investors. A truly sincere smile. This humanitarian angle of saving the seniors had surprised and delighted him the moment it left his lips. Around the table, the men sat back and loosened their ties, grunted at each other in a tone he recognized. In fact, it was the only tone his meetings ended in these days, since he'd taken the closer job with Tornado. One by one, the men filed out of the room. He shook each hand with a vigor that suggested everyone was about to become a lot richer. The last hand he shook belonged to a man who told him, "We're not going with the fulfillment center, but we've got something else for Langford." Ronald smiled, kept smiling. Out of the window of that 30th floor office, an osprey flew into the turbine of an ascending jumbo jet, spraying feathers into the sky. Earl Griswold was sweating. I'm gonna have to change that last name. I have trouble saying it. Call him Smith. Earl Smith was sweating. That's a great name. Mall management had turned off most of the power, which meant no AC. Aside from his headlamp, the only light came from the emergency kiosks and the skylights at Center Court Atrium. His last job at Rolling Hills before it was buried in landfill was to pack out all the vending machines. His last job anywhere, really, since he was retiring. Sun would set in an hour. He mopped his brow with a hanky. Aside from the seniors walking club, vending machines were part of the mall's last gasp for relevancy. They'd formed a kind of midway down what had once been the Grand Promenade to Center Court. Coin-operated massage chairs vibrated invitingly in front of the old Foot Locker. Between Claire's and Ardeen, a photo booth promised cherished black and white memories. Claw games in the lobby of the old theater shrieked enticements at regular intervals, though there was seldom anyone there to hear them. For 6 months, Rolling Hills even had a Samsung Electronics vending machine until thieves threw a vibrating chair at it. They got away with it too. CCTV cameras have been dead for years. If it was up to Earl, he'd let the damn machines rot, but they weren't technically the mall's property. A few enterprising individuals had been convinced that Rolling Hills still attracted enough foot traffic to turn a profit. Mall management knew better, but they hoped the arcade-like ambiance might attract young customers to the remaining shops. It didn't. He'd spent the whole day wheeling them out into the parking lot on a dolly. Now, only Candy Island remained. It was usually in the lobby of the old theater, but he'd been past there 3 times already. His phone made the 9:30 whistle sound. God damn it. And his voice seemed to echo forever. Earl had been the maintenance man at Rolling Hills since it was built in 1979. Damn if he wasn't going to do this last job right. Just as its name suggested, Candy Island was a circular collection of candy dispensers, 3-tiered, like a wedding cake. While he'd been working, it had rolled past the shuttered Sears store, empty except for a 10-foot-high pile of coat hangers. Candy Island swung a left and rolled past the movie theater, which had been desperately renovated into a 6-screen multiplex in 2003, before a 10-screen multiplex had opened across town. In the atrium, it deftly avoided the buckets that caught rain from holes in the skylights. Earl heard it first, the clicking of wheels on marble. He stopped and raised his head like he was sniffing the air. When it rolled into view and stopped, he sneezed hard. One by one, each candy-filled globe released and emptied its contents onto the marble floor, or at least that's what Earl assumed happened, because after the first dispenser dumped its payload, he turned and ran.
Thank you.
I was reading a section from my first story. Also has an IPG kind of theme to it. And I'll just start. It's from near the middle, so. And it's one of the longest stories in the book. So, hey there, champ, a voice says. Well, what? Clay cracks open a bleary eyelid, not wanting to be dragged to wakefulness in the light of the moon. There's a face 2 inches away from his own. Their noses are almost touching. He feels a tickle in the whiskers of his blonde mustache. Ah! Clay lets out a short shriek and recoils from the too close place. His heart suddenly kicks into a 4th gear from a dead start, hammering in his chest like madly rotating pistons. What the hell, man? You scared the shit out of me. Is silently chortling to himself, hand covering his mouth, taking perverse joy in Clay's fear. I know, the dead man says. That's what's so funny. Forearm across his Our abs is there sore from laughing so hard. His long hair hangs down straight, free from its braids. What are you doing here, Clay? He says, you're gonna wake up my parents. Ayala tilts his head for a moment, listening. Asleep as a stone, then looks back at Clay. Thought you could get rid of me that easily, did you? What do you want? Clay stutters. I already returned your job. Ayala waves his hand. Manu, all's forgotten, that's forgiven. Then wriggles his fingers like a caricature of a ghost, elbows raised, French leather of his coat dangling, shoulders hunched, low register drawl. I came here to warn you. As he speaks, there is a distant growling punctuates his words. Though Clay knows he's trying to be funny, those snarls kind of undercut the humor. A ghost pretending to be a ghost. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for those wonderful readings, really great to have a little taste of each. So I wanted to start by asking you all, since you're all writers of multiple genres, why the short story? What draws you to this particular genre or form? How is it different or similar to some of the other genres that you work in? And just jump in.
I'll start. Well, I started writing more as a poet, and what I love about the short stories, I feel like it's kind of a poetic form because it's compressed and it's kind of tight, and there's a lot that you have to suggest because you can't tell everything, and I like that kind of the gaps and the kind of bits of the unsaid that are left in it, and also because I feel like it's quite close to a kind of storytelling. It feels the closest to a kind of storytelling voice or storytelling kind of tradition, and I like that size, I guess, the size of that kind of tale, you know. So yeah, I love the form, even though it's incredibly hard to write. Yeah, that's my take, yeah.
That's my answer too.
Okay.
And then these came out, I was a poet first, right?
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
You still are.
these feel like, well, I was writing poetry with lots of characters though, right? And which you don't always do in poetry. Some of my poetry is character based. And so expanding that into stories makes sense. So it feels like, but I mean, I think short stories are good for ideas too, right? Thought experiments. They're a good size for a thought or a concept. Whereas something like a novel feels like it's going to be characters progressing over time. It's kind of a different container.
Yeah, thanks for pointing out that difference, because I often with my creative writing students when we're studying short fiction talk about that, like, is this an idea? What kind of story is this? Is it an idea short story? Is it a character-driven short story? Is it a sketch? What is it? And the connection between poetry and fiction I often think about, but I'll hear from other people. They might have more to say about that too. Nathan or Carleigh.
Well, I wrote my novel first, and it was like, I was just kind of like, wasn't ready to write another novel again. So so it was just kind of like laziness. Like I can't spend, because it took me 10 years to write my novel. So I'm like, I can't do that right now. I needed to like do something. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write something short. So then that's how I started writing short stories, because I'm like, I just couldn't handle writing another novel. But then they still kind of ended up being really sprawling and kind of mushing all into each other. So, and like all the characters were interrelated, and even though I was writing short, they kind of just started building on each other and became this book. And also I was cramming because I wrote a lot of it in a summer because I was going to go to do my master's at UBC creative writing, and I'm like, I need to have writing to workshop in all these classes. So I was like, I started writing like a lot, just so I would have something to share, and that kind of forced me to write. So I'm good at procrastinating, so.
That's my next panel, the art of procrastination.
We'll see you there.
Maybe. I might be now, right?
So having deadlines helps, and so that's how I came to the short
Good motivator, Nathan. Good motivator.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would write short stories only forever if I could. I got really lucky because I had just been hacking away at this novel and it was time that maybe we could sell it. And I spent the summer, it was so blocked, and I spent the summer just like, after years literally of being like, you need to work on the novel or you're wasting your time. I just started writing stories again, and all of a sudden I felt like relatively, like I went from feeling just like a hack, would like never write another word in this town again, to being like, oh yes, I have vibrant things to say, and I just, all of my confidence came back when I started working on stories, and I tend to become really obsessed with a topic, an idea, just really for a period of time, and then I'm done. And that's what I find with the novels, is that it's like, oh, you again, back to this. So, I mean, I'll have to figure it out. I promised one now, but like, I just keep thinking, like, if I could write novels too, I know they sell better from the capitalist perspective or whatever. Even people would come into the bookstore that I worked and they'd say, what's the latest, insert ultra famous writer name here? And I'd say, well, it's a short story collection. They'd be like, what else you got? But I would do it if I could. I'd write them forever.
Yes. Yeah. I know the short fiction is almost as maligned as poetry. It's like the next, it's the other redheaded stepchild, but it's like, yeah, I even have friends that read quite a bit, and they're like, and I know they won't read poetry. I know that much. Yeah. But even short fiction, I don't really like them. Yeah. What? Yeah.
They're perfect.
I know.
They're so
And
beautiful.
it's interesting too, because it is a form that's also widely taught. Those we all teach, and that is, both in undergrad and grad programs, you're going to be writing a lot of stories, and also it's the genre of the periodical or the magazine, right? It's shorter work, right? It's harder to publish excerpts of a novel, right? Yeah. How can it be complete enough?
Yeah.
And I liked what both Wayde and Cathy were saying about going from poetry to short fiction, and that's also been my trajectory.
Yeah.
And I find short fiction much, much harder to write than poetry, but maybe because I spent so much time in that other genre. But it's when you can get into the poetry of it that I'm like, okay, now we're cooking, But it's hard to get. I find it hard to get there. And I think it was Chekhov that said the poetry, the poem, and the story have more in common than the short story and the novel.
Yeah.
And I always hold that front of mind because they're just very different beasts, very different animals. And I think a lot of readers go to a collection and they're like, what? This isn't a novel. What the hell is this?
Yes.
Because it's just a very different rhythms, right?
Yes.
I was in a world, I've left the rhythm of that world, now I'm in another world. I'm in that rhythm. And this one was 5 pages, this one's 30 pages. What? Right? So moving through that. Yeah. My next question was about, and I don't really like the demarcation of genres a lot per se, or subgenres where people are like, it's literary or it's not. I don't even know what that means. But just many of you work, I would say, in non-realism and realism, right? I think there's a wide range. And I wanted to ask about that because the short story seems to be a form that is quite suited to, obviously Poe and the history of the horror story, but also, magical realism and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the fantastical. So how about working in these subgenres in the short story form? Any insights or thoughts or challenges that you'd like to share?
I'll go first this time.
Okay.
For Monster first.
Yes,
I love that you asked this question because I feel like in my vet innings, in my book, my only published book, it would take an awful lot for me to move from reality to, there would just be moments where I had a story about bees and it just became so obvious that the camera, your sort of story camera, needed to go down into the hive, even though I wasn't gonna have a character like peeking in there, what's going on in there? So, but I really had to build myself up to break from that. And no one had told me that I couldn't, but for whatever reason, I just felt, no, I have to stay with realism. And I feel like over the last couple of years, I feel like in so many ways, like the truth has really let us down in a lot of, the truth hasn't, but people's treatment of the truth has let us down. And I found that when I went to work on my stories, realism was exploded for me. Who knows what that even is anymore at certain times. So the stories and I just jumped into genre and I don't even know what they're called. I'm glad for my students, they can say, oh, that's kind of a dark academe. Great.
Yeah. Tell me more.
Because I don't have a real background reading or writing it, but I just know now it's a really instinctual, like, who cares about adhering to these rules? And the anger and fear that I've had just comes out better over the last few years, just comes out better when I don't have to worry about maintaining realism.
Makes me even more excited for your upcoming book. Yeah. Well, and so often, again, I think that's how it's taught. Like, well, that's your point of view, stick with it, you know? And then you actually read choices and they go through 3 points of view in one sometimes, or right? So, yeah.
For me, it's even though I write like lots of like ghosts and like vampires and Wendigo and like a lot of fantasy kind of elements, but for me, even though there's like all these like non-real things in there, mostly I'm talking about real world things, so they're like metaphors for like reality. So even though the story's like fantastical, it's actually it's about something. Usually the stories are about something else that is real. So even though I'm working in like urban fantasy and horror, it's usually just like a metaphor for colonialism, or usually it's colonialism. but yeah, so that's kind of how I guess it's similar to magic realism in that way, that it's really about the real world. Even though I'm using like the tropes of like urban fantasy and horror, I'm really talking about real world issues and real world. It's very focused on the real world, whereas like high fantasy is not focused on the real world. It's about some other place in the sky, right? So that's kind of my approach to urban fantasy and those kind of elements.
I would say the same for me too. And I was thinking about why I started writing the speculative stories, because they're not all. But the part of the impetus for this book was that, under another hat, I do a bunch of historical activism around Vancouver's original Black community at Hogan's Alley. And I've been doing that for years and years. And which is weird, because started out as a poet and then ended up as sort of a popular historian in a way, I like making stuff up, but history needs to kind of get to the root of things. And so I find that work pretty exhausting. And at the time I started writing these stories, I was quite exhausted with being in the past and being in the archives and recovering this history. And so I very deliberately wanted the next creative thing I did to be set in the future and to be looking into the future. And so this, the future I imagined is now very, very close, because it goes up to the year 2025, which when I was writing it seemed like way far into the future, right? But we've sort of almost caught up to it now.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was deliberately, I want to go in the other direction for a while now. And so it imagines some weird technologies, but generically, I don't know what it's not sci-fi. It's not, there's ghosts, but there's also fantastical technologies, and it's more about the strange and the defamiliar, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great answers. I think I was thinking about this, and I guess something that I always return to is, I don't know if anybody here knows the work of Amitav Ghosh. He's an amazing writer, and his book, The Great Derangement, which is all about basically how realism is really like so over and is so bizarre anyway. And basically the point that the world is so strange that to write within the limits of realism is unreal. Like, it's actually writing an unreality, and I just really click with that whole notion. And but I think for me, I think what I write about a lot is perception and misperception and kind of the mind, and where we how the gap between what we think we see or we know and what's going on, and those kind of liminal spaces, where it may be a ghost, or it may be your mind, or it may be this. And I like to leave that open space. And I feel that the short story really lends itself to that kind of examination of consciousness and point of view. I like, I really like that. So it's kind of like on the edge. It's not like stepping into like Nathan was saying, like I have a lot of students who want to write like high fantasy 2,000 word short stories, and it's like, that's going to be tough because you've got to build a whole world, so I like work that's kind of drawing on a lot of what we know that's given, but then it's just taking it into a direction that's very unsettling or unnerving, and that plays with ideas of perception. And I did that in my novel, where I have a character who sees a character that we never really know if it's actually an actual person or an imaginary person or a ghost. And it was really hard to get that by my editor, who was like, people aren't going to know what to do with this. You have to, it has to be really clear, like, is it this, is it that, and I was like, no, I want it to be unsettling, and that it was interesting to realize how kind of risky that was, that was read as a very risky thing to do in a novel, but I think maybe in a short story, that's a little bit more okay, so I think that's where I like to go to those edges, I guess the edges where realism collapses, I guess. Yeah. So
I like how you put that.
Yeah.
The edges where realism collapses.
Yeah.
In my speculative fiction class, I make them do presentations, so they'll all have to read a novel and talk about it. And I always assign Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut as one of the speculative texts, right? Because he's popping in and out of time, and there's aliens and all that. But then sometimes if the student who has been assigned that reads it very closely, they'll say partway through, is this even speculative? Because there's this suggestion that he just got knocked in the head and he thinks this is happening.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we don't, and I would say, well, yeah, we don't really,
Yes.
you kind of have to make that call. The book is telling you two things, right? And you can decide which way you go. Right?
Yeah.
Would that be an element then of, short fiction in general, and perhaps especially speculative or non-realism fiction, a more capacious relationship with mystery? Or, because that to me that challenge you have with the publisher, which isn't uncommon, and has happened to me with poems and stories too. If you like, I won't explain. Sorry, no. but what about mystery? I guess is a question I have.
I kind of like that ambiguity where you don't know whether things are real or not real, and if you leave it open ended, and then you can also maintain that. If you give them readers like a realistic kind of explanation while leaving it hinting at the supernatural being the possibility, and then both explanations side by side, but then never nailing it down solidly, so that the realism kind of like can ground readers so that they can that suspension of disbelief. So there's that realist. Oh, they're probably just hallucinating or something, or and then there's the supernatural thing that's happening, and then you leave this ambiguity between the tension between what's real and what isn't, and that lets readers enter that kind of the fantasy elements without being like, this is silly, and then throwing the book away kind of thing. So.
I like how you put that, Nathan. Yeah. And also just allowing for multiple readings of a text, and that being the point.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
It doesn't have to be, that's where the reader gets to engage with the writing of it, and it makes such a much richer reading experience, I find, as a reader. Yeah.
That's, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, it's the thing that Amitav Ghosh was saying, and I just feel like we live in maybe it's always been like this, but this whole contested thing of what's true and what's not, and what do you perceive and what's true, and how we don't want to accept things that we actually see, feel, and experience, but we'll find a way to pretend that that's not happening. We're all doing that to some extent, and I just think for that reason, that's a very interesting edge to be working in right now, because it kind of, we're all kind of living it to some extent, Yeah.
I remember doing a class with George Bowering years and years ago, and him, dropping this idea that realism as a literary genre, it was itself an experiment, right?
Yeah.
That's experimental.
True.
Because it's really just a way of approaching representing the world, right? There are all these other possible ways. I remember just putting that in its place is really helpful, actually, and kind of liberating. That realism is not just the transcendentally truer method, right? It's just an experimental approach, and all these other, maybe Brecht is more realistic because he's showing all the gears, right, and showing you behind the curtain.
I love that.
different ways of looking at it.
Carleigh, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, well, and what you said, Jen, about, many layers, creating
Yeah.
multiple layers, I do feel like best case scenario for me is that someone will read my short story and then want to read it again,
Mhm.
like to see what else is there. And I haven't yet been able to do that. I haven't yet written a novel,
Yeah.
but I haven't yet been able to figure out how in a story, it's a manageable space where I can be
Yeah.
like, okay, you want to have this going, and you want to have this going, and you want to have this, and someone might read this way. I have stories that I have a story about a canoe trip that often the indigenous people are in the room are like, what a couple of dummies, and the non-indigenous people are like, what a couple of heroes. And
Yeah.
not speaking generally, but that's a best case scenario
Yeah,
for me, is that there's different, because that's I read the same stuff. It's one of my readerly weaknesses, is that I often go back and read the same thing again. It's like the Starbucks of, I like to go back and reread. That sameness really comforts me. So with the stories, I mean, it just makes perfect sense that I would want to go back, and I hope that a reader is like, I think I kind of got that, but I'm going to read it again.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's so much we learn when we read and reread and reread. And because I teach a lot of short fiction, I often have read a story 10 times and the 10th time I'm still like, how did they do that? Oh, wait a minute, I didn't notice that on number 8 or what have you. So there's and the shorter form allows that too. You can, it's not a huge time commitment to read that novel again, right? Yeah. I had another question or was there more anyone was going to say about that?
Maybe just that it's
Yeah,
harder to maintain that ambiguity between reality and fantasy in a longer work, because you have to sustain it for so much longer
Yes.
before the possibilities collapse. So
Yeah.
it's a bit more of a juggling act to maintain in a longer work. So I think it's easier to do in a shorter story.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Earlier, Cathy, you were when we were talking about, connections between poetry and short fiction, and you had mentioned gaps. And that there's the question I had for you all that has a quote from Lee Miracle again, talking about she writes about the importance of leaving gaps in oral stories so that listeners can chime in and add to the tale. And so she writes in Dancing My Way Out of My Way to Orality, she writes, not everything is fleshed out. Enough must be said to spark the listener's desire to contribute to the story. And so I wanted to ask you all about that, because I guess, again, for me, and I know, some others of us coming from poetry to short fiction, the gap, what is left out, is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me short fiction does this more masterfully, maybe because we have fewer pages and we can tweak it, like you said, and we're going back for draft 30, and we're like, I'm still going. But that more is more conversant with the gap than perhaps novels are. I mean, that's a big generalization, but thoughts about that, leaving gaps for the reader. How does that work in short fiction? Anything folks might want to say about that?
Yeah, I called my first collection, Bad Endings, because I was really expecting people to not be kind of annoyed with the endings of the story. Not that I ever, I don't ever try to annoy a reader. We're in this wonderful reciprocal relationship.
It's just a gift. It's a serendipitous talent.
It just happened. But it was really that I remembered, while I was writing the stories, I remembered this reading stories as an emerging writer and an emerging reader, that I would be so frustrated when I would get to the end, like, this is not done. There's not, this, what happens next? And over the years, that started to change from just being really angry about it to, as I said, I'd be like, there's more here. I'm going to go back and read it again. So the gap for me, and I got some really good editors. Thank goodness for editors. Thank you, editors. My editor just recently took note that gave me a compliment. You're really good at nailing those endings, but I think that you might rush towards, and that does often happen, as I lay down this line and I'm like, yes, the end is so good. Now I just need to write to it to get to this point. And so I guess I maybe leave an unintentional gap sometimes. And my most common workshop note was always like, I think this needs something a little more at the end, to which I would disagree silently.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. But just before that, sometimes I'd be a little bit rushy in that. But I would like to finish something off in the reader's mind. I'd like to give the reader some kind of closure and some feeling. But that, to me, the best question is, I wonder what happens next. And then maybe some reader engagement, some imagination about what happens next, and hopefully not too annoyed that I didn't say exactly.
Thank you for that. So yeah, the gap at the end.
It's funny, I'll just say something for editors, because I worked with Susan Safian at Arsenal Pulp with this book, and she didn't really have any really big suggestions or substantive editorial suggestions, except for in one story, which was The Secret Commonwealth, where she said, this is not the ending, there's more, you have to write more. And because she was not very hands-on with it, but she was certain about that, I listened to her. I thought, well, okay, if you're adamant about this one thing, I think I'll do that. So I went back and wrote another ending. I wrote more, exactly that, then what happens. And now, I mean, that might be my favorite story in the collection. And that, I think that was absolutely the right decision. Which makes you kind of wonder, I mean, about your other endings, if you're right about them or not. Right? But I don't know what it is that she saw. I think it was a very open, the way I left it was very, very open. And I kind of knew what happened after, but she made me sit down and write it out, and then a little bit more emerged in doing that. And I think, I guess, is what the story needed.
It makes me want to return to that. So I'm going to ask you what your
The
original
ending.
one was.
Yeah,
What was
no,
added?
yeah.
Yeah. I love how we went from gaps to endings. That's so let's talk about both, because I think they're both really important and really generative. So
I guess I'm really interested in how time works in short stories, because it works quite differently from in novels. Like novels are really like time. There's a certain thing you just have to do in a novel with time, where it just kind of has to go forward, and there has to be a little bit more solid feeling of, we start here, we go here, and we end here, and it's kind of whereas I think in stories it's a lot more tentative, and there's almost a feeling like, I feel like it kind of undoes that chronological expectation. And I like stories that really play with that, where you're not just starting here, going here, and going here. You're kind of in several places at once, and then maybe you kind of or just a feeling of, this is just this little piece, and we know that there's all this here and there's all this here. And that's kind of the point, is that you start looking at what you're not seeing, and that's kind of in a way what the story's doing, is making you look at what you're not getting. And I just for me, I feel like that fits more with my own experience of time. Like, I actually have kind of a real struggle with, I mean, I teach narrative structure, and I try to, but it's like, I actually can't stand it. Like, I just, truthfully, I'm really bad at it. And I just, it just, things don't, I don't experience life in that tidy way, and I don't really make my work in that way. It kind of, so I think the story's more forgiving and interesting in that way. Yeah.
I don't really like knowing the ending of my stories, or like when I'm writing, I don't want to know how it ends too soon, because if I know how it ends, then I'm like, it's not as much fun for me to write, because I'm like, if I plan everything out too much, it's not fun for me, because then I know the ending already. I need to not know the ending for a long time, and then at a certain point, I guess I'm like, I have to figure out how it's going to end at some point. So I have a target to shoot for, but for a lot of it, I want to leave it like the ending, so I don't know how it's going to end. So I have to keep writing to find out, right? So if I know the ending, then it kind of ruins it for me. So I don't want to know the ending too soon anyway.
Yeah.
That makes me think, can I ask a question of everybody?
Yeah.
Do you outline for short stories?
Sometimes, yeah. Like sometimes I'll have, like with the Indian burial ground story, I wrote, like I did a lot of research. I knew that I specifically wanted to have this topic, that I was like 1990, like horror movies, and the whole trope of the IPG. And so then I was doing lots of research about it, and then just thinking about it, and then I sent myself a prompt, which is like three living, 3 dead, and 3 objects. And then that was, I didn't know where it was going to go, so I just started with that prompt, but I didn't outline anything beyond doing the research and setting up myself the prompt. And that was the structure. It was 3 living, 3 dead, 3 objects. And then I didn't know how it was to end, or where each of the stories would intersect, or where they would end up. So I left it pretty open. yeah. So I was writing towards the ending, but not knowing where anything was going. So
Writing toward an ending you didn't know. Yeah.
That's neat.
And then so I don't usually know the ending, and then I think one of the stories, which is like sometimes I'll have an idea and it'll just be rattling around in my head for like 10 years and then I'll sit down and it'll just come out in like 2 weeks and then it'll be done. I'm like, wow, that was easy once I sat down to do it, but it was just hovering in the back of your head for like 10 years, thinking about this one thing, working away in your subconscious and then so sometimes it happens like that.
My outlining for short stories is minimal generally, but this time around, my stories are longer, and I really tried with Bad Endings to write stories, and because I think it's such a good exercise to try to write them all in one time period. Because I leaned heavily on like this is happening here, and then the 3 asterisk magic that just makes time advance, but when I tried to write them all in one time period, then it was hard but good. But these stories are a little longer and a little bit more complex in the writing anyways. So I do find myself, not necessarily an outline, but I have to jot down at a certain point. And I was trying to write a story, love to make things hard on myself. I was trying to write a story in a backwards chronology. And man, I did write out several before I just finally gave up. I just write it forward. What are you trying to do here? Throw roadblocks in front of yourself.
I find it's a very mysterious process, and I usually have like an image or a phrase or a feeling or something, and I know that that's the story, but I'm discovering it as I go, and I'm very surprised by the things that emerge that I was not expecting, and I'm like, oh, okay, so that's how that is, and then I'll write some notes on that, and then I write a bit more, and I'm like, oh, and it sort of like unfolds as I'm doing it, which is quite maddening sometimes. But I've tried outlining, and it's like, I leave it in the dust by paragraph 2. It's gone, So, but I like what you said, Carleigh, about I did the same thing with some of my stories where I gave myself that. The Greek unities thing. I don't know if it's saying one place, one time, one set of characters. Like, that's a really good set of parameters, because you just have to get everything happening. It puts a pressure on it, and I had to do that because I was getting so like digressive and like, so that's a good way to create pressure.
It's another way that stories are like poems, I think, is that I always I have this discussion with my students. They're like with a sonnet, you spend so much time, or I certainly do, if I'm trying to write a sonnet, just laboring over trying to find that word, trying to make it work. And it's so frustrating. But then when it hits, when you get it, it's just such a feeling of like, yes, that is right. And so constraints, they're frustrating. And I do feel for my students, because often I'm like, write this in 2 weeks. And sometimes it's weird, because I feel it's like creative writing, the only class where students come to you and say, can I have 50 pages for this, please? Like, I feel like every other like, can I write this in 3 pages? But those constraints, there's some magic that happens there.
Totally.
And the kind of pressure cooker that you described, right? Do you outline?
I do, but
but
the same thing happens 9 times out of 10, which is the outline. I have this long outline, and then the story lives in this little section of it, and then the rest is just, it doesn't go there at all. So
That's cool.
I'm not really sure what that's about, but most of the time the outline blows way past. But I think it's all going to go in the story when I start the story, and then it becomes a little slice of it. Do you outline?
I do far along in the process. So I work a lot very similar to Cathy. It sounds like, and maybe Nathan, like there's a lot of just figuring out. I never know my endings. It's just note taking and ruminating sometimes for years. But then when I'm actually in the work, maybe draft 6, draft 7, I start arranging scenes. So I'll be like, okay, now how are these scenes going to go? Like, is this working? I still need to write this scene. Okay, I got to get them in there. So that's when I don't know what the story is or what it wants to be until I'm pretty far along in the process. And then I start sensing, there's other scenes, or, I've workshopped with Cathy before, and she's like, what about this? I'm like, you're right, I need to write that scene, and so you go back in and write that scene and then figure out how it fits in. So, yeah,
That's interesting.
yeah, so laborious. Just one thing about endings. I don't know how your experience as readers too, because I just read tons and tons of short fiction, and short fiction endings are often flubbed. That's my experience as a reader. They're really, your book is great. They're not bad endings.
It's actually not.
I was like, where's the bad endings? They're not there. But so it's in holding that sense of mystery, openness, but you've got to give some closure. And so often I'm loving a story, and then I'm like, what? Why you do me like that? Like, it just so often I'm like, nope. And it's when I read a writer that can master endings, I'm like, they know what they're doing. That's really hard. That's high level work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So any other thoughts on, I know we already talked about endings, but about how hard they are, I guess. Yeah.
You don't want to tie things up in a nice little bow.
Yeah.
If it's too tidy, no one will like that either. It'll be like, it's too perfect.
Yes.
So you got to leave it like messy, like a really tidy bow, and then just like leave it really messy, kind of. And unless you're specifically trying to subvert expectations, where they're like, it can't end like that. It can't end like, oh yeah, it ends like that. Like, what? So you gotta mess with your readers a little bit, because otherwise they won't.
Annoy, mess.
You can't make things too neat, and you can't make things too messy. So there's like a fine art of like hitting that moving target for your.
For sure.
That's kind of like,
I tried to figure out at one point why James Baldwin always has such great endings.
Oh,
And I noticed what it is he usually ends on an image, right? It's not a piece of dialogue. It's almost always an image that's contains within it what's gone before, right? So,
That's a secret weapon of short story writing.
Yeah.
I think
Sure.
so. I think so.
And
Yeah, ending on it.
and they're the marriage with poetry, right?
Yes.
The image must be ascendant in some way.
Yes.
Yeah, and like the swerve, Nathan, that you're referring to, right? That when it's nailed, it's amazing. Like short endings, you're like, whoa. And then at other times the swerve doesn't work. You're like, that came out of nowhere. It doesn't fit with the rest of the story. And why did you end it that way? Yeah. So it's a very,
Yeah,
Interesting.
I feel like sometimes a story lives in its ending, really. Like, I feel like that is where the story is kind of made, or that's where you get, oh yeah, that's the story. That's what we were doing. And and I really love stories that do that kind of swerve, where the thing you get at the end actually kind of undoes or reworks everything you just read. And you're like, whoa, but it's really hard to do, and you can't force it. It just kind of happens. And I have a number of stories that are sitting around waiting for an ending, and I'm like, okay, I really want to find this ending because I feel like there's something else that needs to come in, and sometimes it just takes time for that to show up, but it is but I know what you mean about stories that don't do that. And that's why for me, like, I can love everything about a story, and then I get to the end and it's like, and I just feel like it just kind of, it's tough.
it is really
Delicate process. Yeah.
This, I know it was probably George Saunders who I read, but I think this has probably been said a lot, but this really worked for me when I was teaching and when I'm writing, is that he says an ending should feel inevitable.
Right.
So there's a feeling, and inevitable is where you just think, yes, that's where the story was going, as opposed to being tied up in a bow or tidy or handy.
Is the whole thing that he says it needs to be both a surprise but feel inevitable?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I know in my head I was like,
Yeah.
you're only getting half of it, Carleigh. Help Wayde.
which is a paradox.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's like-
exactly.
It's a total paradox, but it's a really good one.
And that's why they're so hard to do,
Yeah.
because both of that tension, right?
Yeah,
Between,
you need both,
like you have many unfinished stories sitting around. And I've had the experience only a couple times of going back to a story maybe 5 years later and realizing the ending was there.
Yeah.
And then it's a little bit of cutting, and I'm like, oh, it was there. I just couldn't see it back then, right? But sometimes just sheer time will show me where the ending was. But
Yeah.
So we're going to open up for questions from the audience in just a couple minutes. I just have one more that I wanted to ask you all about. Or is there any, from our delightful conversation, which I'm learning so much from, is there anything you all want to ask each other? I have a couple more questions that I could get to before we open it up to the audience, or is there something you're kind of burning to ask each other, that you're sitting in a circle or half circle with these great short story writers? Unfortunately, this doesn't happen every day.
I have a weird question, which is
Bring
maybe
it.
something I'm struggling with is do you feel that you will remain loyal to the short story? Because I think it's really hard, because you get kind of like so much more attention and chops for writing a novel. And it's like, everybody thinks, well, you start with short stories and then you grow up and you write novels and then you're kind of done with the form. And I said I'd never do that. And then I kind of did it. And then now I'm like, anyway, I just like, I guess in your practice, like where does the short story sit in terms of your, not that I want everybody to say, yes, I will write short stories forever.
Yeah, she's going to extract
part
the
of
blood
me
from
kind of
it.
wants
Right, so.
But I'm just interested in that, how that sits with you.
Yeah,
Good
it's true.
question.
It's such a thing that you grow up to the
Yeah.
novel. And I just, for me, at this, we'll see what happens, because I always hate every process until I've finished it. And then I think, I love that. That was amazing. So we'll see when then
Yeah.
perhaps
Yes,
I'll feel
yes.
so victorious after finishing the novel. But right now the plan is ride or die short stories, like short stories as often as possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably not. I think I did things backwards. I wrote a novel first, and then I went to did my master's in creative writing, and then I wrote a short story collection. I'm like, I'm doing everything backwards. So I don't know, but no, I don't. I think I like the long sprawling kind of
Yes.
stuff. So yeah, I'll probably just go back to doing long sprawling things, but just
Sure.
to take so long.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm in a weird situation where, so I'm writing my partner and I are writing something together. So Anne and I, we wrote a short story together, and that came out of conversations we had about, Betty and Barney Hill. Betty and Barney Hill were the original kind of alien abductees, the ones who were abducted in the 60s. And they were the ones that developed this idea of missing time and the grays that all comes out of Betty and Barney Hill. And they were an interracial couple. It's a really interesting fact. And I knew about them long before I ever saw a picture of them. And I was like, whoa, that's so interesting. This is in like the early 60s. And so we've been talking about that for years. And then that just came out in the short story collaboration, right? And I think it's great. We got published in Prism. And then we just thought, let's just keep working on this. So we're trying to do that weird thing, which is expand a short story into a novel. And so we're in that process. And that's really weird, because what do? The original one wrapped up, right? Had an ending. And so do you open it up so it goes beyond that? Or do you write the context that went before? Is that original story going to still sit in there somewhere? Or what we're sort of thinking is that's because there's missing time and missing memory. That story, what happened to them in the story might be a suppressed memory. So who knows, right? We're in that process of figuring that out. But I don't know. That's another weird thing that happens, is when short stories want to be bigger.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
After they're done, right? That's the
Yeah,
weird,
they're
that's
like,
the weird thing.
You're not done with me.
Yeah.
It's like a double challenge you've set for yourself,
Yeah.
because the short
It
story
is.
to novel,
Yeah.
right? And was it Kalabato who did that with Snow Country, I think? Or did he write Snow Country and then distill it back into a 20-page story? I can't rember which one.
That's to
Yeah.
do it that way
Yeah,
would be
but-
amazing. Wow.
And then collaboratively,
yeah.
and with your
that-
partner.
that's true.
I mean, that's just like way too advanced for me. Not in this lifetime.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
I mean, my favorite novel of all time
Yeah.
is The Boot of Suburbia by Hanif Qureshi. And that began as a short story.
Yeah.
And I went back and read that story, and it's so different, right? The first part of it's the same, but the ending is different. You can just see where he just changed the ending and stretched it out into this novel. It just worked beautifully. But, and I think if I remember right, that was just a commission. He was just, the editor at the New Yorker was like, give us a story. He's like, okay. And then wrote that story. And then later thought there's more here.
And then developed.
Turned into
Yeah,
this beautiful
well,
novel.
Ocean Vuong's debut novel was from an essay, right? So it was a New Yorker essay about his mother and intergenerational trauma and the Vietnam War. And then you read the beginning of his novel and you're like, oh, this is essay. But then he turned it into a novel, not a memoir, right? So really fascinating how short can become long.
I guess that's a way
Yeah.
to answer to your question,
Yeah.
is that I think the particular story has a need, whether it
Yeah.
wants to be short or long, or a poem or a memoir. Or whatever.
Yeah.
It's less about I'm going to write a novel, more about I got the story idea and what's the right
Media.
form for this.
Yeah. I really want to ask you all about influences, so just humor me. I'm just really curious about who, because I love this form so much, and again, I feel it never gets enough airtime. Who are the short story writers you read or have most influenced you? Even just one or two names. Who do you return to? Who do you study? Like, how the heck did they do that? I want to do that. I'd love to hear. You mentioned Baldwin, and I'm like, I got to return to Baldwin. He's definitely been a teacher to me. Any short story writers you all particularly gravitate toward to study the art?
Yeah, I thought about this ahead of time, and I really appreciate that you asked this ahead of time, because I have this embarrassing thing where I forget
I'm the
titles.
same. Exactly the
This
same.
amazing book by
Yeah.
changed my life. Yeah, I've read it 50 times, but
That happens to me too.
So thank you for asking ahead of time, because I
Yeah.
was like, okay, I was even going to write it down on this, but I didn't. Leanne Simpson, This Accident of Being Lost, because she just goes ahead and writes about stuff in it. I think there's we're still in a real thing where it takes all kinds of writing, but writers from marginalized communities right now, I feel, are being pushed very hard to write about trauma, the history, and as if that's the only space that we can inhabit. And it's those people are doing very important work in that space, but it's not the only space that we can inhabit. And in This Accident, and Leanne Simpson has written about everything, but in This Accident of Being Lost, she writes about online dating and just
kombucha.
Stuff. Yeah.
Kombucha makes a big appearance.
And just stuff that I was like, yes, thank you, Leanne. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. I was really lucky because my book came out at the same time, and I'm not comparing myself to Leanne Simpson, but it was two short stories by two Indigenous writers, and I had written about stuff, thinking like, oh, I hope this goes okay, and I hope I'm not they don't take my identity away, because that's just what I wanted to write about. And I had to say too, Carmen Maria Machado. I can't remember the name of this short story collection right now, but
Body and Other Parties.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
Body and
that's
Other
great,
Parties.
yeah.
And I have to bring it up because I read it and I thought, you're the only person in the world who doesn't really like this book. I was so annoyed with myself. And so I put it away. And what I found is, particularly right now, the number of times that I've referenced Carmen Maria Machado, gone back, convinced my publisher that the story needs to be this way because Carmen Maria Machado did it in Her Body and Other Parties. So it's something about that, probably jealousy, didn't sit right with me at first, but it became a major influence anyways. And that has never happened to me before. So yeah, that was a big one.
Yeah, even what we push away ends up, there's a reason for the repulsion, right? And it often, maybe they're an uncomfortable teacher or a teacher we don't think we're ready for, that we are. Yeah.
I'd say Thomas King. I read a lot of his work. I like how he uses repetition, and his style is completely different than mine. I can't write like him at all, but I do love his work. And recently, I've been reading a lot of books written from the second person. I don't know why I'm on this whole kick of reading. I'm looking for anything written in second person. You. I don't know why but I've read. There's only so many books written in that POV, and I don't know why, but I'm kind of on this second person kick right now.
It's the official POV of the pandemic, in my opinion. I'm calling it now. You're going to see a lot of
Interesting.
That is a
because
really
it's
cool point.
so often you've been told not to write it.
There's a book called Aura, and that's magic realism, but it's all second person you, and there's something kind of weird about the POV, because you're sometimes you feel like it could be you're the character, or you're reading about the character, and you're flipping back and forth. It's weird, really strange.
Yeah.
Anyway, but that's.
A student just told me, I just read her collection of short stories this summer, Jemison, NL Jemison, but apparently she's written a whole novel in second person. A student just referenced it. I was like, oh, I loved her stories. I'm gonna have to read that novel. Yeah. Her stuff's so weird and awesome.
Yeah, I actually wrote an entire list. It's on my phone, and I'm trying really hard not to look at it and just do it from memory because I feel embarrassed about it. Because I know I'm going to forget really big names. The two names that are standing out right now are Jamaica Kincaid. I love Jamaica Kincaid's work. the kind of risks that she takes with point of view and voice. I really like voice, like distinctive voice. And then a writer that I really like is an Irish writer called Claire Keegan, who writes amazing short stories that I don't know. They just they just cover so much ground, and they do like incredibly intense topics, but they do it so delicately. I find her work really. It's not even necessarily quite like what I write like, but it just makes me go, God, the story is such a great form, when you read something like that. So I'm really, really into her work. There's just a million others. There's a very obscure writer from the UK called Anna Cavan, who wrote these really bizarre, very freaky speculative fiction stories that I just really groove on, because I just think it was incredibly courageous, the crazy stuff that she was writing about. Nobody's heard of her because she was like, but I think sometimes stories can talk about things that don't, that the novel isn't ready for in some weird way. So I'm interested in that too. Yeah. Anyway, I could go on forever, but
Thank you for
just
that,
a
James.
couple. Yeah.
For this book,
Yeah.
I mean, a particular book by Roberto Bolaño, which is a weird book. I don't know I guess it's marketed as a novel, but it's not. It's more like a faux encyclopedia. And there's something running throughout the book, the attraction to reference text. Because when I grew up, I grew up with a mom who was a reader, but who was the type of reader who never kept books. Like books were just once you read it, it was out the door. Like so she would read a lot, but there were no books in the house except for, an atlas, the dictionary, atlas and the dictionary. And so I would read those, and then so I know all the countries in the world. and then my dad saw me reading the dictionary, and he was like, "Oh, you like that kind of thing?" So he got me, a kind of incomplete encyclopedia set from Army and Navy. So then I would read that. I would read the entries in the encyclopedia. And Bolaño's book is this fake encyclopedia of these Nazis, but they're not real. They're fictional, but it feels like a reference book. And so it's this weird. Anyway, I love that book because you can start to trace a narrative through it. And so, in a way, that kind of leaked into this, and the idea of seeing a narrative take place across these different stories, and some of them are, podcast or annotated bibliography, as one story is, or all these weird grants, these weird arts grants and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess there.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that story before. So I'd love to hear, I'm sure we'd all love to hear some questions from the audience if folks have any questions for these short story writers. Yeah, person there with the ear. You? Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Barry, and thank you so much for this. I'm a musician, and so I was really interested in your gaps and in conversation on gaps and endings, because in music I find I write songs. Sometimes a bar of silence is worth 2 bars of, cramming 16th notes. And sometimes a song will resolve from the root chord, and sometimes you can leave it hanging on the dominant fifth. It's different ending, right?
Yeah.
But I'm really curious about this notion. How do you feel about this notion of a short story as being some kind of, is it publisher's construct or a competition kind of thing, that we're constrained into this number of words that represent a short story? And how do you feel about that? Is that a straitjacket for you sometimes, or is it freeing? At other times, it feels a little artificial, right? The number of words. If you go 3 more words, you're into a novella. Right? And 2 few words, and you're into some kind of lyrical poem. So, just curious how you feel about that. It's drop.
I love it that nobody really knows what a novella is, you know? You
I
can't-
was just thinking that.
Nobody's.
Talk about the
there's-
redheaded.
Yeah,
I know
there's
you
no
were
real
saying that.
yeah.
consensus as to what the
Yeah.
number of words really
Yeah.
is that makes, because you know, is the Metamorphosis by Kafka a short story or a novella? Heart of Darkness is it a short story or novella? Who knows, right? I don't know. Depends if they think they can get away with selling it as a single.
Exactly.
Now they would sell it as a novel.
Right.
Yeah.
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 I don't
Jack
know.
up the price.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Put in extra filler pages,
Yeah.
you know, hard copy.
I don't know.
I don't usually go by like the strict, oh, it has to hit this number of words. It just ends up done when it's done. And if it's really short, it's really short.
Yeah.
But if it's really long, it ends up being really long. One of them in here is like the longest story is like, 67 pages or something, which is like, well, I guess that's kind of almost a novella. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it just had a lot of characters. So, but I don't, and the shortest one is like, I don't know, 4 pages or something. So there's a pretty wide. I just go by however organically how long the story needs to be. And then your point about music is interesting too, because a musician friend once asked me, or mentioned that silence is as important to a song as the notes, because it gives the shape. It's like a negative space in a painting. It's like the blank areas. So I think it goes back to our discussion about like leaving mystery and ambiguity, and all the stuff that you leave out can become sort of like the negative space, or like the silence in like a musical kind of composition. So there's parallels between all those kind of art forms in terms of what's left out.
And I wonder if the question too is because, as we probably many of us have noticed the word count is getting shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
So for those of us that publish short stories,
Yes.
it's hard to get short. I
Yeah, it
found
is,
that
yeah.
it's really hard to get them published now, because I'm like,
Yeah.
when was the last time I wrote like a 2,000 word short story?
Exactly.
It's very
Yeah.
rare I write something that short these days. And often I'm just like, there I am, 500 words over the count again.
Yeah.
So I think, again, because of production costs, how many pieces they want to put in a journal or magazine, but it's harder and harder to publish kind of the 25 pagers or the 30
Yeah.
pagers. So I wonder if that might be part of the constraint that some folks are feeling. Another question. This person in the front row. Yeah.
I'm not a fiction writer, but I've been writing a memoir for many, many years, and then I leave it. I know there's a lot of good stuff in it. It's about living in another culture, and it's the 60s, so it was a very special time. But I was brought to come here because I think it's too big for me to write a memoir as I originally thought it. Now I'm thinking of short stories, incidents. And Wayde, I remember you were written up in Islet, what's her other name?
Islet Chavari, yeah.
You helped her. She is the nearest to my experiences, because a lot of my experience was India too. I lived in Nepal. And so but I taught myself to be a journalist in Nepal and wrote for the paper and in Bangkok. And I've got to get out of being too journalistic. And I almost feel now I'm quite old and, I'm not forgetting the stories because they're amazing. I'm not good with dialogue, but I almost need somebody else to write with me, but I don't think I can afford that. Is there any kind of something that jumps out that may help me to do this as stories in a memoir?
I think Ayelet's book, The Art of Leaving, is like that,
Yeah,
because
I
it's
think
a memoir, but it's episodic, and I think a lot of the chapters began as essays, standalone essays.
But it isn't consecutive. She jumps
Right.
all over the place.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I haven't done a lot of training other than teaching myself. I guess I live on Bowen Island and I've never been able to have a writer's group there, but I think I need other people with me because I keep leaving it, doing other things.
I always thought Bowen Island was lousy with writers. Are there lots of writers out there? It feels like a writer
Well, there
place.
are, but They're all very private. I have one person.
That's why they live on boat.
Yeah,
A couple other books that might be of interest are Fred Waugh's Diamond Grill.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't read it yet. Fred Waugh, Diamond Grill. So it is a
Yeah.
memoir in very short pieces. And then I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list. And friends have been talking about it. Carmen Maria Machado's new memoir is also in little bit-sized pieces. So definitely it is, people are definitely writing those kind of memoirs. Yeah. So we don't have, I'm Carmen Maria Machado. And I can't remember the name of her new work, but it's a it's
The Dollhouse?
Dollhouse, yeah, in the Dollhouse or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have,
Carmen Marie Mercado and Dollhouse.
yeah, exactly,
It'll be in there
exactly.
somewhere.
And they're very short pieces.
Yeah. So we have just a few more minutes. I could take one more question from the audience if anyone has a burning question that they want to ask these writers about the short story. Yes, this for person right here.
There was a kind of a quick reference, I think, from you about the relationship to writing for magazines. I was just wondering, since you're all so devoted to the short story, what is your relationship with magazines versus publishing your own group of stories versus being an anthology, or how do you think through those things? Because it takes so much energy to go in all those directions. I wonder which one you choose and why.
Well, journals, that's like the fuel for my fire. It's the best thing ever when you can have a story come out in a journal, because then people can read it immediately, because you have to squirrel away all of your short stories while you're working on that. I was so grateful when I got the contract that I said, oh, there's maybe a couple of these that I'd like to publish. And my agent, for very good reason, said, I don't think so. And the publisher said, yes, I think we can do this a couple of times, because that is what keeps me going when I get to publish a short story in a journal. And you get to see it. And there's often some beautiful design that goes along with it. And this thing that just looks so silly on a piece of paper on your computer screen all of a sudden feels real and legitimate. And so I hope, someone said to me once, a very established writer suggested, I said, are you still publishing in journals? And they suggested that they didn't want to take up space in journals because they saw journals as the realm of the emerging writer. And I was really disappointed. I don't know, does that mean I have to stop at a certain point? But
I've never heard that before.
No.
Yeah,
Never
and
heard
that's
that
it. As
before.
time
Yeah.
passed, I thought, I don't agree. Yeah. When I read a journal, I look forward to being able to see like a range of backgrounds of writers. So yeah, love
Me too.
Love the
Yeah, the
journals.
new voices, the the established.
And then you get paid twice for the same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you can publish like a couple of these stories were in anthology. So then I dusted them off and then put them in the collection. So even if you have published somewhere else, you can usually after a year the rights revert to you and you can publish it again in the collection. So I wouldn't be too cagey with your work if you're worried about that.
Yeah, I don't think you have to choose between them, and I think it's more like the journals and the anthologies are sort of like the place where you can try things out, or you put something out and see how it's like, because the publishing process is so incredibly slow, and it's just like takes so long. And often when the book comes out, you're like, I don't know if anyone else had the experience, but you're like so in a different place, and it's like, I mean, you love the book and it's great, but it's not like, so it's nice to have that more close to the time you've written it kind of response to it. And I think with short stories, I just think we want to get them out as many places as you can, and getting a collection of short stories published is actually quite hard, because a lot of publishers don't want to publish them because they think they don't sell as well. So I know people who've published tons of stories in journals and they never put out a collection for either they just chose not to do that, or they just weren't able to get that happening. So I think the story lives in a lot of different places, and that's why it's good to read those journals, because you may read work that you may not find elsewhere. So yeah.
Well, thank you all. Thanks so much for joining us today. And just maybe we'll end with a round of applause for these wonderful authors that we've had out today.
Thanks, Jen, for doing a great job. Oh,
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
That was delightful.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.